Over the past few years, I've been wondering how the comics market could have done more to save itself. And I remembered Shonen Jump collections on the magazine rack at the store back when they were in print in America. These were monthly titles adapting stories from weekly collections back in Japan. Also, these stories may not have been licensed from other companies, but I have seen various intellectual properties licensed out as manga. King of Fighters, Darkstalkers, Fate, and some non-gaming titles like Cowboy Bebop. Why not Marvel Comics? They've made efforts in the past to reach out to that market before. And the most prominent example was the Marvel anime, Iron Man, Wolverine, X-Men, Blade, and 2 movies. There was always a focus on making Japan the setting, with Blade and Wolverine battling an original character, the wandering swordsman Kikyo. So why not license 4 IPs of Japanese characters to publishers like Viz Media? Viz has put out a lot of manga. And for the purposes of this article, we're going to use Marvel examples. You know what they say, the fate of Marvel is the fate of the industry. So, if we limit our searches to those with less than 200 appearances in print, capture their events and dialogue exactly, and throw in some new between-the-scenes content, we can arrange it in order of canon and not publication. Then, lastly, we can establish a deadline within the comics content for the mangaka to break off and do their own thing. Ideally, it would be when the characters backtracked or when the company changed hands en masse at some point. But by this point, retelling this many stories from a different perspective would let the assigned writer know the material well enough to move forward on their own without relying on Marvel canon any further. Now, who do we choose and why? My first 4 are, in no particular order, Mariko Yoshida, her half-brother the Silver Samurai, the Rising Suns, and obviously the Big Hero 6, themselves founded by the Silver Samurai and others. As for those selected, I'd like to start with the Rising Suns. They were only in 2 issues of Generation X, and they were tidbits following a mass depowering event about them, but otherwise, nothing in canon. So it's the most freedom to move about creatively and get a feel for the process. Once you form the team and establish them as a cohesive group, they can show the same Generation X story from their own perspective, even if they do lose. In the remaining time they are in print, then they can be free to tell whatever they want, as long as it doesn't feature or trip over someone else's continuity at the time. They carry some still timely 90s nostalgia, and that one two-parter, Being a Loss, could showcase a classic mix of risk versus reward that could let their series rival hero in training manga My Hero Academia. My second choice is the Silver Samurai. Because of who my third and fourth choices are, he moves so close to the top. He figures prominently throughout their stories as well, so he's really important. And if you cover just his story, the others will also be featured. prominently also featuring the hand. Eventually, his mantle is succeeded to his illegitimate son Shingen. But first, he starts out by facing Daredevil in the air, after growing up the illegitimate heir to a Yashida crime lord and training much of his life in the old ways of swordsmanship. After that failed bid with the Mandrill, he finally finds a regular master in Viper, leading to a steady string of defeats, but following his team-up with his future brother-in-law to save the first Spider-Woman from the influence of an evil blade and stealing a teleportation ring from the cast of Saturday Night Live, he began to have a slowly growing list of victories and began his turn to an anti-hero. He even became a founding member of our next choice, Big Hero 6. I know I mentioned his connection to them before, but since they were left out of the Disney movie and Kingdom Hearts sequel, I'd like to reiterate. Those took a lot of liberties and tried to take templates from the Teen Titans show to keep things safe and marketable. Fredzilla actually transformed into a kaiju, and Wasabi was a chef of the blade. Eventually, both of them were intended to be replacements for Sunpyre and Ebon Samurai, who themselves were intended to be cheap stand-ins for Sunfire and Silver Samurai, as they were so busy in the X titles. Personally, I do see some remaining similarities. Silver Samurai used his powers to activate a plasma sword. Wasabi wields a plasma blade. Sunfire's powers come from atomic radiation. Fredzilla is an homage to kaiju, powered by nuclear blasts. And lastly, the fourth is split between Mariko Yoshida, her ally, romantic rival Yukio, and her daughter Amiko. Mariko gradually develops agency, leading into her tragic end, and was wasted in the Wolverine anime by Studio Madhouse. And her presence can be spread out by featuring tales and exploits of the other two, occurring when she was still alive. We tend to see Yukio when she's overpowered. How does she train, and what can she keep up with? Ami-chan starts as a baby orphaned by a kaiju. So how does she grow and develop from there? And how's her training with magic coming? In the miniseries Wolverine Soul Taker, Amiko's bloodline is revealed to be the Shosei Order priestesses, thus leaving her in training to be the successor to newcomer Mana Yanoa, who never shows up again, and in Amiko's next outing, she's an armored vigilante next to the second Silver Samurai, complete with armor and her own laser sword. There is a lot of meat missing from these bones, which brings us back to the original problem with these three. None have had their own series, they just appear in Wolverine stories. Even the exception is Yukio showing up in an Elektra series. A new series focusing on them would streamline things, make a status quo, but such a manga adaptation would be the first to do so. On the flip side, there's one more to work with. A sixth hero, if you will. Originally, I was thinking of continuing the adventures of Takuya Yamashiro, the Japanese Spider-Man by Toei, but he started on TV and needed roughly 4 decades to show up in the comics. So he doesn't count for this, but seems perfectly suited for an ongoing series in print. If you first retcon her to be his daughter, Silk could even make some appearances. Miguel O'Hara was on the multiverse-spanning Exiles and their Wetworks sister team had a symbiote Spider-Man. There are a few other Spider-Men with narrative means to cross over, which gives the ability to test in a new market another appealing angle. The massive crossover of Spider-Man could also be told from his perspective. Or at least Peter, Miguel, and Takia could appear shoulder to shoulder or in a three-way battle, each transforming in the blink of an eye. They could also be introduced to each other by Billy Braddock, the only Spider-Man to also be a Captain Britain. Champions of their native realities in the face of the multiverse. After the final defeat of Professor Monster, Spider-Man could face Dr. Demonicus, comics' original villain for the Shogun Warriors and Godzilla series. Spider-Man could face any number of geneticists, monster makers from Marvel's many small screen productions, all led by this man, who also leads the Pacific Overlords, who also stole the Iron Man armor, and was repeatedly the adversary of the West Coast Avengers. And speaking of Godzilla, look at what could happen if Marvel renewed their licenses with Toho. But that's not going to serve as this retelling. Would be a hit though. Imagine if these two had a crossover. Well, that's enough of my pipe dreams for today. What are your pipe dreams for Marvel? Who do you think would be good material for manga? Who do you think should instead be reinvented for the manga audience? Please let me know in the comments.